Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Before we start, may I take this time to remind everyone of our house rules and reminders for today's event. To our participants, please be respectful. Treat the presenter and other attendees with respect. Avoid interrupting, making rude comments, or engaging in side conversations that are visible to everyone. During the Q&A, please use the Q&A chat box function and kindly type your questions briefly and clearly. Participants are requested to virtually remain in the webinar until the end. We would also like to remind everyone that the webinar will be recorded and uploaded by the organizers. If you have any questions or inquiries, kindly direct them in the Q&A function. Lastly, please continue to observe proper decorum throughout the sessions. The organizers strive to ensure a high level of security for your personal data. The organizers will comply with the Philippines Data Privacy Act governing data that was gathered as a part of the registration process during the event and during the evaluation. Good day to all our participants who have joined us for today's event. PAX Asia warmly welcomes all of you to the webinar, Vietnam's Security Landscape, Troubles on Land and at Sea. Today, we will examine the security challenges that Vietnam faces due to the great power competition, intense land border relations, as well as the heightening disputes in the South China Sea. As the geopolitical landscape shifts and great powers exert their influence, we have a vital opportunity to think of the implication on strategic advantage and what factors ultimately shape Vietnam's security landscape. Today's webinar is brought to you by Fax Asia, a nonprofit organization based in the Philippines. Our aim is to provide and host expert events and analysis on foreign and public policies to be utilized by stakeholders and policymakers. It is our goal in Fax Asia to be a platform and avenue for unique Southeast Asian perspective on matters relating to international affairs. My name is Florence Principe Gamboa, Program Manager of Fax Asia. I will be your host and moderator for today's program. It is a pleasure to be with all of you here. This discussion takes place at a pivotal point when many Southeast Asian countries grappling with the growing competition between China and the United States. Vietnam is placed in a unique position. It is therefore worth discussing its strategies and ability to balance between mitigating non-traditional risks like cyber threats and environmental degradation in the Mekong Delta, as well as the looming influence of China. The implications of these intensified issues in the region do not just pose vigorous exercises in statecraft amid increasing globalization and multipolarity. They also show us a glimpse into Vietnam's strategies in dealing with intensified pressures to put on its sovereignty and status as a middle power in a unique threat landscape. We have four esteemed speakers who will be given 10 minutes each to discuss their views and insights. Before I introduce them, our organizers have requested for a quick photo session. Lisa, please let us know if you have taken a screenshot.
All right, big smiles, everybody. 1, 2, 3.
Now, let us start delving into this relevant discussion as I introduce our first speaker for today's webinar, Dr. Bic Tran. Dr. Bic Tran is the Vietnam Program Convener of Fax Asia. She is also a Senior Fellow at the Verve Research and a Non-Resident Fellow at We Protect Our Seas. Dr. Tran has been selected to join the 2025 Young Strategies Forum and the 2024 International Strategy Forum. Her research interests include grant strategy, maritime security, cybersecurity, and other issues at the intersection between geopolitics and technology. Dr. Tran, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Florence, for the introduction, and many thanks to FACS for these opportunities. So today I will talk about Vietnam's strategic adjustment from a continental to a maritime focus. So Vietnam is usually categorized as a continental country due to its long land borders and traditional focus on land-based security threats. However, recognizing the growing importance of maritime domain in shaping regional power dynamics, economic opportunities, and security challenges, Vietnam has increasingly embraced its identity as a maritime nation. So in terms of policies, during the 2006 National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Vietnamese leader highlighted the need to develop a comprehensive maritime economic strategy. And only 1 year later, the party's Central Committee issued a resolution on Vietnam's maritime strategy toward 2020, recognizing the 21st century as the centuries of the oceans. And after more than a decade of implementing the 2007 strategy, in 2018, the Central Committee passed a new resolution outlining a sustainable marine economy strategy toward 2030, with the goals extending to 2045. So this one is more focused on the economic aspect of the strategy than the 2007 one. And the 2019 National Defense White Paper officially recognized the country as a maritime nation. And this is significant for several reasons. So first, it justified the increased investments in naval and maritime law enforcement capabilities to enhance Vietnam's ability to protect its maritime interests. Second, it's provided a strategic narrative to support its claims in the South China Sea. And lastly, it's articulated a vision of Vietnam as an active player in the regional maritime security affairs. So potentially open venues for greater cooperation with other maritime countries in the Indo-Pacific. So just to be clear, this orientation does not imply a complete abandon of continental concerns, but rather a reorganization of priorities. Vietnam's approach now seeks to leverage its unique geography, treating both continental and maritime domains to maximize its strategic flexibilities as well as economic potential. So in terms of, the economic aspect of Vietnam maritime strategy, it has invested in seafood industry, oil and gas industry, seaport development, maritime transport, and coastal and island economic centers. So the development of Vietnam's seafood industry demonstrates its commitment to leverage its maritime resources. As the country has significantly expanded it and upgraded its offshore fishing fleet. This enables them to access more distant and more productive fishing grounds. At the same time, it has fostered the growth of maritime agriculture, although it's still on a relative smaller scale. And in addition, Vietnam has developed a processing industry that meets the international standards, facilitating its, rise as the rank to one of the world's top seafood exporters. So by developing its fishing industry, seafood industry, Vietnam's not only boosting its economy, but also reinforcing its territorial claims in the South China Sea. So in terms of oil and gas activities, the intensification of those activities serve multiple strategic objectives. First, it fosters Vietnam's energy security, try to reduce its reliance on imported fossil fuels, but moreover, it strengthens Vietnam's de facto control over disputed maritime features. And Vietnam also invested, in developing a system of seaports, particularly deep water ports, to meet regional and international standards. So this plan, aimed to create major gateway for international trade, increase investment, and modernize infrastructure. The key objectives of this plan include rapidly increase cargo handling capacity, minimizing cost, and ensuring high competitiveness. And Vietnam also prioritized maritime transport, as a crucial component of its broader maritime orientation. This underscored the recognition of maritime transport as, in enhancing Vietnam economic competitiveness and regional connectivities. In addition to that, Vietnam stressed the importance of establishing and developing strong maritime economic centers. Key goals include, having the marine economy sectors contribute to about 10% of the GDP, and the economies of the 28 coastal provinces and cities account for 65 to 70% of the GDP by 2030. So now I will move to the security aspect of Vietnam's maritime strategy. So Vietnam has focused on upgrading its naval and coastal capabilities in the late 2000s, largely in reaction to China's growing assertiveness in the South China Sea. A highlight was an order of 6 Russian Kilo-class submarines worth $2 billion in 2009, only a few months after China had submitted a map to the UN, the United Nations, featuring the night dash line. So those submarines were delivered between 2013 and 17 and greatly enhanced Vietnam maritime defense capabilities. In addition to that, Vietnam has acquired, a lot of survey vessels, warships, mostly from Russia, and also try to develop its own domestic shipbuilding capabilities by building vessels based on Russian design. And the Navy has also added patrol aircraft to its fleet. So even though that Vietnam's military strength is still significantly less than China's, but its strategic investments have, developed some ability to deny access or control over certain areas, which could hinder Chinese operation in an armed conflict. And besides modernizing efforts, Vietnam has deepened defense cooperation with key partners, including India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. India has, with its own experience operating Kilo-class submarines, India has trained hundreds of Vietnamese sailors to operate the submarine that Vietnam purchased earlier. Japan has supported Vietnam maritime law enforcement capabilities with the provision of vessels and equipment. Australia has focused on, capacity building and providing scientific and technological assistance to Vietnam in the maritime domain. And the United States has supported Vietnam's maritime security, first with the delivery of 18 new patrol boats between 2017 and 19, and also it has provided advanced technological assistance to improve Vietnam maritime domain awareness. A key element of this support is Sea Vision. It's an advanced web-based maritime situation awareness tool promoted by the U.S. Navy but managed by the U.S. Department of Transportation. So, in short, Vietnam embrace of maritime identity reflects its recognition of maritime potentials as a critical enabler of national power. And through strategic mobilization of previously underutilized maritime resources and opportunities, Vietnam has gained profound benefits for its economic development and national defense. So I will stop here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bick, for that comprehensive overview of Vietnam's reorganization of priorities, highlighting the importance of its maritime identity and what happened with its economic and security policies after that. Let us move on to the second speaker, Min Son To. Min Son To is a PhD student at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, Australian National University. He received a BA in Politics and Government from Sciences Po Paris and the MSc in Asian Studies in the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Nanyang Technological University, where he then worked as a research assistant for the School of Social Sciences until his doctoral studies. Min, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Florence, for the invitation to the FACTS webinar on Vietnam's more exigent security economic landscape. I would like to share my screen real quick for everyone to have a bit more clear direction as I shift towards the eastern flank of Vietnam, which to our very special relationships with Cambodia and Laos, which have a very controversial relationship history with Vietnam, which I think are still quite relevant today. So this is my presentation. Quick note that it's based on a research article that was published in International Relation of Asia Pacific. So if you want a whole thing, you can probably search it up with the same title. Without further ado, I'll just go quickly through more of the historical settings of these relationships, just distilling the more important facts for us to consider in the contemporary affairs. And then I'll move more of a case-by-case comparisons between Cambodia and Laos relationship with China and the Vietnam factor within it as the intervening factor. And then move it towards more the contemporary context where there's quite a few more developments regarding the ways that these countries have tilted towards China. So in my presentation, I would like to start off by thinking about how these two countries, Laos and Cambodia, have often been considered more of a client states or satellite states to China. But a closer look at how they really deal with questions of regional affairs in China and as well as Vietnam. It's a bit more nuanced than what we might think. An easiest example would be comparing to the way they handled the ASEAN chairmanship in 2012 for Cambodia and in 2016 for Laos, where they exhibited different kind of restraint towards their bigger neighbors' interest in pushing forward the South China Treaty issue. We all know the Cambodian chairmanship in 2012 is quite controversial because Adam was not able to provide a joint statement on South China Sea, and actually quite a few things happened to the Philippines as well. But in 2016, with Laos at the helm, they have exhibited a more restraint. It's not successful in pushing for a very hard-coded language on the South China Sea, but they managed to do it in a way that did not cause too much external intensity or conflict. This, I would say, can be attributed to the way they relate to Vietnam. Just a key example is Vietnam and Laos in fact, do have a military relationship, and they reaffirm that time and time again every year, tracing back to their own revolutionary origins. And of course, Vietnam had an invasion or a liberation campaign in Cambodia, toppling the Khmer Rouge, ushering in the current ruling party, but still manages to be able to get bogged down in nationalistic hostilities. So this complex relation is something that's relatively overlooked in the way scholars in the region have typically looked at these three countries. So this is my question: how did they relate to Vietnam and thereby condition their respective relation with China? So just to quickly set the scene, during the late 1980s, towards the end of the Third Indochina War between Vietnam, Cambodia, and under the Khmer Rouge and China, there's a growing sentiment of wanting to end the conflict because it's getting too costly, nearing a decade by then. But what really truly propelled all of them to end the conflict was the disintegration and the crisis that was undergoing in the Eastern Bloc, as well as in China during the time with the Tiananmen Square crisis. These elements, assessed by Vietnamese strategists as very important, and essentially shifted the way that they think about their own internal and international affairs. And they wanted to normalize relations with China and caused a lot of there's a lot of internal conflict during that time out in the direction with China, where essentially the Communist Party leadership outmaneuvered the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in pushing for a more to normalize relation with China and thereby reintegrate with the world. And they tried to do so in a way that they look to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a new sort of resolution to the conflict they have now, as we're going away from the conflict. And Vietnam indeed even lobbied for Cambodia and Laos to be acceded into this. Laos and Vietnam joined at the same time, and Cambodia joined a few years later, due to the coup that they had during that time in 1997. But what can be remembered from this period is a shift from Vietnam towards a more normalized relation with China, the collective regional interest in peaceful external relations, and the end of Vietnam's campaign in Cambodia, ushering essentially opening the way for what ASEAN has been known today in this focus on non-interference, economic development, and peaceful regional politics. And moving to Cambodia, the Cambodian relationship with China since 1997 is quite complex, but it's important to bear in mind that, oh, sorry, drop video. It's important to bear in mind that Cambodia and China stand out as a very few special countries. Oh. Hold on. Is everyone able to still hear me?
Yes, Min,
Oh,
can hear
okay,
you.
sorry. Apologies, the video froze, so I didn't know. Anyway, Cambodia stand out as a few countries that China consistently supported, minus the Khmer Rouge time. The China accommodated the Sihanouk, King of Notre Dame Sihanouk in exile, offered post-genocide peacekeeping in a way that managed to rehabilitate its relationship and image among Cambodians. They did not protest Hun Sen's coup, and in fact offer a very timely, I would say, considerable amount of aid with no string attached to Hun Sen at the time that enabled them to get a degree of stability and policing capacity during that time that they continue to see as valuable. More contemporary times, Cambodia is Vietnam's biggest, China is Cambodia's biggest investor. They are they're Cambodia's first bilateral trade agreement partner. They have generously provided COVID-19 vaccines to Cambodia. And so you can see that there's a very consistent positive trend towards them with very little obstacles. And in turn, Cambodia provides support for China's policy goals. And a little thing can be mentioned about the Ream Naval Base, which recently opened. Um, it has been assessed that it could be considered an opening for China to perhaps utilize, but I should caveat that this has not quite come to fruition. The scenario of China paving a naval route through the country, through the Mekong to Cambodia is relatively far-fetched because there's quite a few waterfalls in it. So far, the Cambodians have kept their base relatively open, but there's still some skepticism there and then. So I still kept this thing inside for the moment. And in a remark, Hun Sen said that if they don't rely on China, who will they rely on? So it does show that the Cambodians have a very positive embrace of China since the end of the conflict. Moving west to Laos, you can see a sort of similar trend as well. Laos is slightly more fragile and vulnerable in a way compared to Cambodia. They are an ethnically very fragmented country with only just around 50% majority of the lowland Laos ethnicity, and the rest of the country is very diverse. And for this reason, they are very keen and aware of how big and powerful the neighbors are. In fact, like, China was not spared from their skepticism during the Third Indochina War, where they feared that China might interfere with ethnic relationship at the borders at the height of the conflict. And so they understand in China's importance in maintaining their regime security, both in ethnic as well as economic matters. More contemporary time, after their accession to ASEAN, Laos undertaken a vision for itself, becoming the battery of Southeast Asia and wanting to transforming their landlocked status to a land-linked status by pivoting towards transit projects, railway projects, connecting with their neighbors, China, Thailand, and Vietnam, most pertinently. And obviously, everyone has known about the China-Laos Railway. I've been on it. Actually, the pictures you see on the right, on the left-hand side, is my pictures. It's very costly. I would not really disagree with the assessment that it's put Laos into its current issue right now. But in any case, it was still very, very widely well received in Laos. They do consider it a national pride. And it is a project that doesn't have much of analogs in other countries. Um, Laos also Laos also sought China's aid in building dams. A lot of projects has been done, but I should note that this is also their dependence on Thailand as a source to import their energy. So there's a complex regional dynamic here. But in any case, China has been willing to help out and chime in a lot of capital for this vision. But when comparing to the way they lean towards China, I obviously mentioned the ASEAN chairmanships here, but I wanted to add this slightly, which is I personally think is relatively interesting. Um, is the way the US pre-Trump, of course, pre-Trump 2.0, related to Cambodia and Laos. So looking at the integrated country strategies to these countries in 22 and 23, I noticed that the US was noticeably pessimistic towards Cambodia. They mentioned it in relationship as an all-time low, limited to protecting American citizens and maintaining a degree of civil society. But there's a noticeable cautious optimism towards Laos, recognizing its strategic location as a heartland of mainland Southeast Asia. And they were very willing to assist in Laos ASEAN chairmanship and integration. Not so much of the more pessimistic, negative tone that they had adopted to Cambodia pre-Trump 2.0. Laos indeed actually has a comprehensive relationship with the US, which, if you compare it to Vietnam, is a step before the current strategic partnership. Instead, what they have with Cambodia, it's just a high quality, high level. What the Cambodians had instead is a high quality, high level relationship with China, but not much of the US. So this nuance I personally find interesting and sort of sparked my own interest in the region as well. Um, and so I moved towards this section of this, considering the domestic matters of Cambodia and Laos. There's a lot of unresolved baggage, as one might say, since the Khmer Rouge regime and the toppling of the regime in the Third Indochina War. Inter-ethnic animosity still exists between the King majority, the majority ethnicity in Vietnam, and the Khmer ethnicity in Cambodia. This is deeply rooted, tracing back to during the colonial times and the struggles against the Western country in that time, Vietnam. And in fact, it played a minor, actually, I wouldn't say minor, it played a considerable role in Vietnam's partition because the demographic in the North Vietnamese and the Southern Vietnamese are quite different, more diverse in the South. And this affected the way that the Vietnamese can be united. Moving towards more the UN transition regime in Cambodia. This regime, in fact, weakened Vietnam's influence in Cambodia a little bit because it compelled Vietnam to show its goodwill to refrain from interacting too much and interfering too much with Cambodia. But unfortunately, the UN regime also failed to end factionalism in Cambodia. A lot of fighting factions in Cambodia at that time, leading to what we call now a coup by Hun Sen, or Hun Sen's preemptive coup to ensure the country stayed intact. After Cambodia, after the UN regime, Cambodia is still a relatively fragile democracy, unlike Singapore, Laos, and Vietnam. This resulted in two major dynamics where they do not have an ideological connection to Vietnam anymore. They're also more susceptible to nationalistic or populist demands. And in fact, one might say that Hun Sen does derive legitimacy from this. This perhaps is much more noticeable in his son's rule, where national hostilities and protests. I've read through articles that traces the protests against Vietnam back to even the earliest stage of the end of the conflict, and this has stayed consistent. Anti-Vietnamese sentiment is strong across all political stripes, even among civil society actors, and the border demarcation is still unfinished. It has stayed at 84% finish since 2016 or 2017. One other fact I also found is Vietnam actually did not really contribute to Cambodia's side during the pre-year temple crisis with Thailand. So in a way, Vietnam really did try to say non-interference, but perhaps in a way that backfired a little bit. Hun Sen's relationships and his cliques are much more strong than his predecessor, more internationally affected. And you more recent events have shown this to be the case, where they wanted to gain more independence from Vietnam by building a canal, and they withdrew from the development triangle, while of course still keeping Vietnam's capital for their cooperation. So there's a better context here for Cambodia and China's relationship to thrive. Moving towards Vietnam and Laos, they have a surprisingly close relationship that you do not really see around Southeast Asia. Um, Unlike Cambodia, Laos sovereignty since 1975 largely unviolated, and their nationalism can be in a way weaker. There's not much major protests, especially in the single-party regime. And the Laos recognize the need to balance both of these socialist giants next to them. And in fact, they approached Vietnam to normalize relationship earlier than Vietnam could. And if I remember correctly, in a PhD thesis dissertation done by a Laos scholar, showing that Laos in fact did mediate the normalization between China and Vietnam. So there's an interesting way that the Laos try to balance between them. And the and of course, the way that the domestic policy structure is different. Single-party regime rules simply means that they cannot really criticize the regime or the main benefactor of Vietnam. This is relatively understandable. And finally, a very important aspect is the alliance between them. And Vietnam stayed steadfast in its support for Laos in ensuring that domestic affairs are in order. They sent aid during the 2000s to suppress dissent, maintain ties at all provincial levels. Every single province in Vietnam has some sort of interlocal ties with every province in Laos. And back to the history, of course, Vietnam supported Laos during a very brief but minor border war between Thailand and Laos, and vice versa, of course. And the statement that really captures this in the way that they relate to each other. Vietnam considers Laos regime security to be mutually reinforcing. Only when they are stable is Vietnam stable, and vice versa. So there's a degree of bargaining power here that Laos has towards Vietnam that Cambodia does not have. Vietnam does not have. And so this kind of demonstrates the kind of complexity between them. And Laos is able to, in a way, be more tactful in the way it regards China's relationship. And that sort of ushers us into contemporary affairs today. Thank you. That should be it from me. I think I will stop the screen now. That's all right.
Thanks so much for that discussion on the unique role that Vietnam plays on Laos and Cambodia's relations towards China. I mean, we saw how Cambodia, who has been described to have an open embrace of China, but also it has unresolved tensions with Vietnam. We also heard about Laos, which has been described to have also stronger relations with the US, but also relies on China's role in its regime security. There is also a unique role for Vietnam, for Laos, since it's balancing its relations between Vietnam and China. So let's move on to the next speaker. Our speaker is Fan Xuanzong.
Yeah, thank you, Florence, for the introduction. Let me share my slides with everyone. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
All right. So my presentation will perhaps is very complementary towards what Ming Sun just has presented. And I will focus on the contention in Vietnam's relations with its neighboring countries, particularly China, Laos, and Cambodia. And this pertains to several controversial Mekong projects. And first, let me begin by situating the Mekong River within Vietnam's broader foreign policy and its neighboring diplomacy. So, as you perhaps already know, Vietnam's Vietnam prioritizes a relationship with its neighboring countries, particularly China, Laos, and Cambodia. This has been Vietnam's top foreign policy priority for a very long time. These neighbors, they are not bound to Vietnam by geography, but also by deep and complex historical, political, and economic relationships. And Vietnam is also connected to the three countries through the Mekong River. And the Mekong River is a critical lifeline for millions of people in the region that live in the six riparian countries. However, the Mekong Basin has increasingly becoming a space of conflicting interests and competition. And Vietnam, as the furthest downstream country, is very anxious about its three neighbors' Mekong projects. And these include the upstream Mekong hydropower dams and also the recent Funan Teco Canal. These projects, combined with the threats from climate change, pose severe risks to Vietnam's food security, its socio-economic stability, and also environmental stability. So Vietnam faces a very important dilemma. How can Vietnam protect its vital interests in the Mekong while maintaining stable relations with its neighbors? And particularly what are the challenges faced by Vietnam when it comes to these Mekong projects? So first, China operates 12 large mainstream Mekong dams and also 95 tributary dams in the river. And importantly, these dam projects have been developed unilaterally without consultation with the lower Mekong countries. And China's dam development has also contributed to dam construction in the downstream region, first by making it more economically feasible for hydropower generation, second by providing a model for dam development, and third by providing direct investment. And in this context, Laos, with the ambition to become the battery of Southeast Asia, is now operating 77 dams in the Mekong River and is planning to build 61 more dams, including 7 on the mainstream Mekong. Cambodia's dam development has been more modest. The country has 4 large operational dams. And in 2020, Cambodia implemented a 10-year moratorium on building mainstream Mekong dams. And this resulted in the suspension of 2 potentially disruptive projects in the Mekong mainstream. A major point of contention between Vietnam and Cambodia, however, is the China-backed Funan Teco Canal. And this is a waterway connecting the Mekong River near Phnom Penh to the Gulf of Thailand. And the project aims to boost Cambodia's transportation and economic development while reducing its reliance on Vietnamese ports for exports. And the canal is currently being constructed. These Mekong projects pose severe risks for Vietnam's Mekong Delta environmentally. The Mekong Delta is Vietnam's agricultural powerhouse. It supports 80 million people and contributes 1/3 of Vietnam's GDP. But it's losing water and sediment, critical sediment, at an alarming rates. China's cascade of 12 mainstream dams, along with the dams in Laos and Cambodia, has significantly reduced water flow and sediment reaching the Mekong Delta. This sediment loss diminishes soil fertility for agricultural production. It can also accelerate riverbank and coastal erosion and prevent the delta from naturally replenishing itself to counteract the impacts of sea level rise. Moreover, the untold river flow, often attributed to Chinese dam operations, have been linked to both droughts and floods in downstream countries. And regarding the Funan Teco Canal, Vietnamese experts fear that it could divert a significant portion of the Mekong's flow away from the Mekong Delta. And this will further exacerbate water scarcity, sediment loss, and saltwater intrusion in the Mekong Delta. But beyond the environmental concerns, there are also geopolitical concerns. China's dam building spree illustrates its growing influence in the Mekong region and has also led to increased geopolitical competition with the United States and its allies. Through the Lancang-Mekong Cooperation, China has offered water diplomacy and substantial funding for the lower Mekong countries, with the aim to counter the Mekong-US partnership. While this institutional competition has brought extra resources and technical assistance to the region, it has also drawn the lower Mekong countries into broader great power rivalry and also raised the risk of overdependence on external powers. And although China presents its upstream dams as beneficial for flood control and for drought relief in the region, many critics argue that these structures provide China with undue leverage over the downstream countries. Whether China could use the water flows as a coercive tool remains a debatable topic. However, this is a perception among several policymakers in the region. Meanwhile, China's financing of dam projects and other infrastructure projects in Laos and Cambodia deepens its economic and strategic presence in the region. And the Funan-Teco Canal built by Beijing has raised concerns in Hanoi because it further weakens Vietnam's traditional influence over Cambodia and also raises fear of a Chinese strategic presence near Vietnam's western border. In navigating these environmental and geopolitical challenges, with China, Vietnam follows a principle of cooperation and struggle. On the one hand, Vietnam engages with China actively in the LMC with the aim to call for greater transparency and promote further data sharing and water governance. At the same time, Vietnam frequently raises concerns about the impacts of Chinese dams and also supports alternative Mekong initiatives led by the US, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. These initiatives serve as both a counterweight to China and a way for Vietnam to internationalize the Mekong issues, thereby increasing pressure on China for more transparency and environmental cooperation. Regarding engagement with Laos and Cambodia, Vietnam has relied on bilateral channels and also the Mekong River Commission. And we can also see that Vietnam has shifted its approach over time. So in 2012, when Laos first built its mainstream dam, the Sayaburi Dam, Vietnam called for a 10-year suspension of the project, citing insufficient environmental assessment and risk to the Mekong Delta. But despite Vietnam's concerns and objection, Laos proceeded with the project, and Vietnam's subsequent calls for the construction to be halted proved ineffective. And so this experience prompted a more restrained approach by Vietnam, realizing its own limited influence. So in response to Laos' second mainstream dam, the Don Sa Hong, Vietnam requested a delay, but emphasized that it wasn't opposing dam development in Laos, just seeking better environmental assessments. And in 2017, during the consultations for Laos' third mainstream dam, Vietnam no longer calls for a delay or suspension of this project. Vietnam realized that it is impossible to stop Laos from building dams because of Laos' heavy reliance on hydropower for economic development. And so instead, Vietnam's diplomatic efforts concentrated on strengthening the MRC consultation process. And this led to the first joint statement by the MRC members that urged Laos to conduct comprehensive impact assessments, to implement mitigation measures, and share updated data in a timely manner. And Vietnam has also taken a mitigation-focused approach towards Cambodia's Funan-Teco Canal. Rather than demanding a halt to the construction, Vietnam raised concerns through bilateral exchanges and consultations within the MRC. Vietnam urged the MRC Secretariat to conduct impact assessments, propose mitigation strategies, and establish monitoring mechanisms. When construction of the canal began last year in August, Vietnam said that it respects Cambodia's decision, but also called for collaboration on research and mitigation. More broadly, Vietnam has also promoted norms and rules for Mekong water resource management through the MRC and ASEAN. But it is clear that Vietnam has been unable to curb upstream exploitation of the Mekong River at its own expense. And this reflects, I think, a deeper structural limitations. So first, we have the weak governance mechanism for the Mekong River. The LMC has faced criticism for prioritizing China's regional influence over environmental safeguards and transparency. Meanwhile, the MRC suffers from structural weaknesses, including a lack of a legally binding authority and vague provisions that allow member states to bypass strict oversight. And we can see this with the Funan Teco Canal, which Cambodia classifies as a tributary project, which allows Cambodia to bypass strict consultation mechanisms. These challenges are further exacerbated by ASEAN's principle of non-interference, which limits the ability of member states to intervene in problematic projects once they begin construction. But there are also limitations on the part of Vietnam's relationship with its neighbors. So first, the riparian countries in the Mekong, they have the sovereign right to develop projects within their respective sections of the river. And combined with weak governance mechanism, this reality means that the Mekong Delta is vulnerable to upstream decisions and goodwill. And secondly, Vietnam's influence is also undermined by its own controversial actions. Vietnam operates 81 tributary dams in the Mekong that have negative impacts to downstream communities in Cambodia. Moreover, Vietnam continues to invest in and import hydropower from Laos, further contributing to the challenges facing the Mekong. And finally, Vietnam also needs to balance its water security concerns with broader strategic priorities. Vietnam cannot risk destabilizing its ties with China or alienating Laos and Cambodia, which could push them further into Beijing's orbit. And to conclude, I think that for Vietnam to address these challenges in the Mekong more effectively, Vietnam needs to pursue three actions. So first, Vietnam needs to assist Laos and Cambodia to transition to non-hydropower alternatives. Secondly, Vietnam needs to prioritize strengthening river governance within ASEAN and the MRC. And finally, Vietnam needs to lead by example by improving transparency and impact assessments for its own Mekong tributary dams. And in conclusion, Vietnam's current approach, while preserving regional stability, has been insufficient to prevent harmful upstream developments. And so I believe that Vietnam must now transition from a reactive to a more proactive role, not by confrontation, but through its credible leadership, through regional collaboration, and through institutional reform. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Zong. It highlighted how the Mekong connects, but also can be a source of discord among surrounding countries, with hefty consequences, not environmental and also geopolitical, for countries, especially in the downstream. There is a need to balance relations not only between the US and China, but also among the smaller states like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Let us move on to the next speaker. The last speaker, Ms. Tu Wen Huang An. Tu is a PhD student of public policy at the National University of Singapore. Concurrently, she is also a Blue Security Fellow at La Trobe University and a member of the Young Leaders Program at the Pacific Forum. Tu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florin, for your kind introduction and warm welcome to all the attendees. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude toward Fact Asia for hosting this webinar and toward Dr. Bichun for the kind invitation. So I have prepared a presentation slide for today. Let me share my screen first. Can you all see my screen right now?
Yes, but it's not in presentation.
So today I would like to talk about one of the most pressing environmental issues facing Vietnam at sea, which is the marine plastic pollution in Vietnam. And I will discuss the current status of marine plastic pollution in the countries, as well as some policy responses that have been conducted by the Vietnamese government, as well as some policy recommendation for future outlook as well. So without further ado, I would like to first talk about current status of the marine plastic pollution in Vietnam. So why plastic pollution? Actually, there are lots of types of marine litters in Vietnam waterways that include paper, glass, rubber, metals, and so on as well. But plastic account for about 80% of marine litters in Vietnam. And among plastic, single-use plastic such as plastic bag, plastic bottle, or disposable cutleries contribute to nearly 72% of all plastic waste. And these plastic contributed a lot to the marine pollution issue in the countries. According to a lot of research, there are two main sources that lead to marine plastic pollution in the country. First is tourism, and second is land-based emissions. So in terms of tourism, is either tourist activities, for example, tourists leave behind trash in the ocean on the beach, or in terms of land-based emissions, it could be some of the illegal trash were dumped into the rivers, and then the trash later on make their ways into the oceans. So these are some common sources of marine plastic pollution in the country. Now I would like to share with you some key statistics about marine plastic pollution in the country to show the intensity of the issues. So actually every day, Vietnam generates over 8,000 tons of plastic. And among the plastic waste, about 0.28 to 0.72 million tons of plastic waste from Vietnam enter the oceans each year. And as you can see here, according to this research and also many other research as well, Vietnam is among the top contributors to global marine pollutions. And later on, I will discuss some of the serious consequences of marine plastic pollution to Vietnam, but also to many other coastal countries as well. But first, let's discuss about what lead to marine plastic pollution in Vietnam waterways. So there are lots of reasons. First is rapid urbanization. Economic development lead to the growth in consumptions, especially in the consumptions of single-use plastic. And I think this is not the only problems of Vietnam, but also of many other countries as well. And also in Vietnam, one of the issues is inefficient waste management, and this lead to an increase in marine plastic pollution. Also, even though the public awareness have been increasing in the recent decades, but in general, a lot of tourists still try to throw away this kind of trash on the beach, which lead to the issue of marine plastic pollution. So now I would like to discuss a bit about some of the consequences of this issue. So marine plastic pollutions, as you might be aware, have a lot of negative impacts on the environment, but also on the human as well. So these plastic have some contaminants and also chemical additive, and this can leach into the waters, and later on it will get absorbed by fish and other sea animals. And these sea animals might be entered to our food chains, and this can be detrimental to human health, especially it can cause hormonal disruption and damage to a lot of organs in our body. And marine plastic pollution especially have a negative impact on the life of a lot of people living near the coastline. because they rely a lot on these resources for food and also for income as well. So marine plastic pollution eventually can lead to financial difficulty, food insecurity, and even population displacements to these people. And then, as you might be aware as well, marine plastic pollutions will disrupt the marine ecosystem, deplete natural resources such as fishery, but also it exacerbates climate change as well. And more seriously, it will pose a hazard to navigations, and it can increase the risk of marine accidents and collision, and thereby endanger life. A loss of plastic objects and particles, especially the big ones in the ocean, can pose a hazard to navigations, and this can lead to some maritime accidents and collision as well. So these are some of the consequences of marine plastic pollution. Now I would like to move to the second part of my presentation, where I will discuss some of the Vietnam's policy responses to the challenge. So at the 2018 G7 summit, the then Prime Minister actually expressed a strong commitment to marine plastic pollution reductions, and they demonstrate a strong political will to tackle with this challenge. But as you can see, marine plastic pollution is still in Vietnam waterways. So what happened? First, I would like to discuss some of the action that Vietnam has been taken. So the country actually ratified several international laws related to marine pollutions. As you can see on the screen right now, these are the international framework for marine environmental protection. And among these documents, the three more important one is first, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. Second, a MAPO, or the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. And third is the London Conventions. This one is the International Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution by dumping of waste and other matters. So these documents are important because they provided the guideline for different countries to develop their own law and policy documents. But on the other hand, actually these international documents are not effective because they are just soft law. So by soft law, I mean that countries have no obligation to comply with the provisions mentioned in these international documents. Vietnam ratified two. First is the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and second is the MAPO, or the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution from Ships. So these are helpful in the sense that Vietnam has been using the document to develop its own law, which I will present in the next slide. So here are some key legal and policy frameworks that Vietnam has been developed to deal with the issue of marine plastic pollution. Due to time constraint, I will not go into every document, but as you can see, here are the key 8 documents. I would like to put your attention to 2 important documents. First is the National Action Plan for the Management of Marine Plastic Litters by 2030. This document is important because it sets the objective related to marine pollution reduction for Vietnam. So in this document, Vietnam mentioned that it aimed to reduce marine plastic waste by 50% by 2025, which is this year, and by 75% by 2030, which is the next 5 years. It is still quite difficult. And then the second important document that I would like to highlight is the Law on Environmental Protections. So this law is important because it issues specific penalty measures for ocean dumping, and also it orders relevant government bodies and people committees of coastal provinces and cities in Vietnam to collect, reuse, and recycle plastic waste in order to reduce the issues of marine plastic pollutions. In addition to the legal documents, Vietnam also have other policy responses, as I show on the screen right now. By 2026, which is next year, Vietnam aimed to ban on the production and imports of single-use plastics, such as plastic utensil or food container. And they also encourage retailers to switch to environmentally friendly bags. And they also try to stop supermarket and store from using single-use plastic bag for packaging goods from next year as well. In addition to these policy, the government has also run a wide range of campaigns with the purpose of raising citizen awareness about the adverse effects of plastic waste. So here I would like to show you also some of the key stakeholders that involved in marine pollution governance. It is a complex issue, so it involves lots of stakeholders, including central government agents such as ministries of natural resources and environments, ministries of finance, of foreign affairs, and of nation defense. But also, apart from central governments, the local governments also play an important role in policy implementation, especially the people committees of coastal provinces and cities. Apart from the governments, private and public sector also play an important role, such as the Vietnam Chambers of Commerce and Industries. They try to encourage retailers from using the single-use plastic, and also other civil society groups such as NGO, epistemic communities, and coastal community also play an important role in marine pollution reduction. But now I would like to talk about some limitations of Vietnam's current response. So as I mentioned, this is a complex issue and involving a lot of stakeholders. But the roles of many stakeholders are still overlapping, and concrete actions that can be taken by each stakeholder are not elaborated in existing rules and legal documents. And as a result, it leads to confusion and also inefficiencies in dealing with marine plastic pollution. So here, I would like to discuss some of the potential solutions that the Vietnamese government can consider to better deal with the issue of marine plastic pollution. I have 4 recommendations here. First is to improve the laws related to marine plastic pollution. Even though Vietnam already have a lot of legal documents, but I think it is important for the government to highlight that marine plastic pollution reductions is one of the top priority for the country to deal with, so that it can create an enabling environments for stakeholders to deal with the issue. And also, it's important to outline clear responsibilities of different stakeholders involved in the issue to avoid confusions. Second is enhanced coordination in marine plastic pollution governance. So even though there are lots of key stakeholders, but I think it's still important for the country to establish a dedicated and leading agency to coordinate the efforts and the activities. And also, central government need to work closely with the local government, because a lot of policy implementation at the local level are still inconsistent. Next, I would like to also highlight the importance of develop the waste collection, treatment, and management system. So this is considered as one of the most important solutions to deal with the issue of plastic pollution. Vietnam needs to allocate a larger budget for the waste management infrastructures. For example, it can consider establish the waste-to-energy plants, recycling plants, or composting plants as well. And finally, marine plastic pollution has no boundary. It affects a lot of countries, not only Vietnam. So Vietnam alone cannot deal with the issue. It needs to increase regional and international cooperation. It needs to actively share information and learn from best practices about the countries. That's also the end of my presentation. Thanks so much for your attention, and I would like to stop sharing now.
Thanks so much for your presentation. It has been great so far. Thanks so much to our speakers for sharing their expertise and giving us a clearer picture of Vietnam's security landscape. We definitely have a lot to think about. And now that we have heard their insights, it's time to proceed to the open forum. We have more than a couple questions in the Q&A function, and most of them are addressed to Dr. Bic Tran. Let us first answer this question. To what extent is inter-service rivalry within the Vietnamese military a concern? Your presentation suggests that the focus is increasingly maritime, but Vietnam remains as a continental state. Are Navy and Army aligned?
Thanks for the question. So I think that probably similar to many countries that different services have to compete for resources. So, from the top down, Vietnam, now we are kind of shifting toward a maritime orientation. But in reality, actually, only the Army has four-star general. So other services like Navy and Air Force only have three-star generals. So that's reality. But the government, I think, try to invest in modernizing the Navy and, the Coast Guard. So I think these services will get more resources in the future.
Yeah, another question is for Fan. Can you explain what non-hydro alternatives are? Also, have you studied India's role in the Mekong Ganga cooperation? And the participant is requesting for your observations.
Thank you for the question. What I mean by non-hydro alternatives are mostly solar and wind power. These two sources of power they have quite promising potential in Cambodia and Laos. And in recent years, both countries have realized that they need to diversify away from hydropower as well. So there's opportunities for Vietnam to help Cambodia and Laos to develop their solar and wind power capacity, especially when Vietnam is considered a leader in the region when it comes to these two sources of renewable energy. And regarding India's role, I don't look at India's role very closely, but I know that Mekong Ganga Corporation is not a major competitor among the major powers because the Mekong Ganga Corporation, I think, focuses more on the non-sensitive issues of tourism, people-to-people exchange, education, and cultural exchange. And it has not done a lot in terms of water security or providing major infrastructure investment like what China has done. So that's why I focus on US and China because they are the major competitors. China provides a lot of funding for infrastructure projects, right? And the US and other countries is allies, countries that are called friends of the Mekong countries. They try to help the lower Mekong countries to improve their water governance capacity by providing technical assistance. So it's directly related to the major contention here is when it comes to like hydropower dams and water security. So India has not ventured into that area of contention, not significantly. That's my observation.
Okay, thanks so much for that, Zong. I would encourage everyone to utilize the Q&A function. We have about 20 minutes left for the open forum, and let me just address other questions here in the chat box. The question is about Vietnam gradually losing its influence in Laos and Cambodia due to China's economic power. To what extent are the dialogues and personal engagements helpful in retaining Vietnam's influence in Laos and Cambodia? Perhaps Dr. Bick can answer this one.
Don't you think that Sun would be a better one to answer this?
Okay, yeah, please go ahead, Min.
Sorry, could you repeat the question? I can't quite see which one it is. Maybe
So there is one question from Huỳnh Tâm Sáng, from Dr. Huỳnh Tâm Sáng. Yeah.
Okay, I just give me a second.
His question is how helpful are dialogues and personal engagements in retaining Vietnam's influence in Laos and Cambodia?
Right. This is a very pertinent question. I do agree these two channels are still quite important. I think my own reflections on this is that it's unfortunately these are still very important things for Vietnam to continue to do. And by all means, they still need to do it. But people-to-people exchange and dialogues are something that should have happened a long time ago. These are processes that take a long time, years and decades to be able to develop a trustworthy relationship I'm not saying that the leadership has not done that. They have done so, but I have sporadically come across chapters and moments during the relationship during the early 2000s and 2010s that show that Vietnam is relatively restrained in the way it can deal with with Cambodia, and it remains very elite-centric. A lot of the popular antipathies towards Vietnam in Cambodia are obviously by people who are, not necessarily elitists. The leadership in Cambodia perfectly knows that Vietnam's leadership is important, but the lack of substantive engagement between them and lack of trust is still remaining a problem. And if I talk to one or two Cambodian scholars, they do agree that Vietnam has yet to be able to really develop meaningful people-to-people channels. Some scholarships there and then, but it does not really go far enough compared to, say, China, which has done pretty well so far, both in economic matters, business-to-business relationship, and people-to-people exchanges. And if you can sort of just look into popular rhetoric in Vietnam and Cambodia, I would generally think that the Vietnamese population has a very relatively narrower view of Cambodia. And obviously the past relationship, and I think you've written on this as well, with regard to the Funan-Teco Canal, where Vietnamese fronted up a discourse of gratitude and ingratitude towards Cambodia, and that popular idea still pervades now. I think these two elements are still quite important, but it should have been done a long time ago. They still need to do now, but this is something they need to bear in mind. And with Laos, the situation is not as severe. As far as I can understand, Lao youth and Lao government leaders still understand that Vietnam is important. However, I think they generally have assessed that China is much more, I should say, more powerful and more capable in giving the Laos what they need. Their case is a bit different from Cambodia, which starts from a lower ground. Laos' case is more of they are deliberately using their own smallness to navigate between Vietnam and China, where if they don't get what they want from Vietnam, they can go to China. If they don't get what they get from China, they go to Vietnam, vice versa. So it's a very tricky situation, and this has been noted before. But for the moment, I think Cambodia is a bit more important. And Laos, some projects, for example, the railroad links between Vietnam and Laos should have been done a long time ago. The Vung Am port project, for example, took more than a decade to finish. And I think it does show to the extent that Vietnam kind of really needs to take its own economic affairs in order to be able to project power. And I think the new direction by the current leadership is doing that quite well. It's still going to take a few more years, I think, for meaningful projection to happen. But yeah, I think that's it for now. I hope that was helpful.
Okay, I have two more related questions for two. It's how can Vietnam bridge the gap between its international commitments and the tangible reduction of marine plastic pollution in its shores? Are there specific domestic policy or enforcement tools that could strengthen the impact of international soft laws? And beyond the soft law argument, what other factors contribute to the continued prevalence of marine plastic pollution in Vietnam? There's also a question in the chat box. What are the implementation challenges for national policy addressing plastic pollution, and how are violators held accountable?
Thanks so much for the questions. So I will try my best to answer all. So first, as the question rightly mentions, Vietnam shows a strong commitments at the international levels that it would like to reduce the issue of marine plastic pollution. But there are some implementation challenges as mentioned in the question as well. So these are first, for example, even though at the central level they have the high commitments, but at the local levels, the policy implementation is still inconsistent across different provinces and cities. And also the cooperation between different stakeholders, such as between ministries and between public and private sectors, are still not very well. So this is because in the law, it is not really mentions the responsibilities of its ministries and its stakeholders clearly. So I think with that, in order for Vietnam to improve its policy responses, I think it is important to mention in the laws the clear responsibility of its stakeholders, and also it need to hold the violators accountable. So now in the law on environmental protection, they prevent on the Ocean Dumping Act. However, they need to have some more specific penalty measures, in my opinion, in order to better hold the violator accountable. So I hope this kind of answer your question.
Thanks so much too. I have other questions here in the Q&A box. Let me just go through them very quickly. I'll go with this one on the South China Sea. How does Vietnam view China's aggressiveness in the South China Sea, and what is it doing to counter this aggressiveness to protect its interests? Does Vietnam view ASEAN playing an important role in stabilizing the tensions in the South China Sea? I have a related question personally, actually. So, despite the clashes in the South China Sea before, Vietnam's relations with China is actually still progressing. You still have cooperation in economics, energy cooperation, and what is the reason behind this? And how does Vietnam still trust China despite the clashes and its aggressive action in the South China Sea?
So shall I answer this question then?
Yes, please, Dr. Bick. It's your expertise.
So Vietnam's approach to the South China Sea dispute is that it tried to isolate the dispute from overall relationship with China, and the two countries actually had an agreement, a written agreement in 2011 on 6 principles on how to deal with sea-related issue. So this document allowed the two countries to set aside the South China Sea disputes and focus on, other areas of cooperation. So Vietnam adopt this practical approach because, China is very important for Vietnam's economic development and also regime survival. So Vietnam and China are among two of the five only left, like five left communist regime in the world. So both of them see the need to, cooperate and side by side. So the party-to-party relation actually help to repair relationship every time there's some incident at seas. And regarding to ASEAN, actually, from the very beginning when Vietnam applied to be ASEAN member, it knew very well that ASEAN will not help to resolve the South China Sea disputes because Vietnam, understand very well that different countries have different interests. But the reason why Vietnam still join ASEAN and still consider ASEAN as a very important platform because it provides an umbrella for Vietnam to deal with external powers, not just China, but also the United States and other great powers as well.
Okay. One more question, Dr. Bick. What is the role of other middle powers in Vietnam's maritime strategy? And for fun, are we seeing involvement from them in the Mekong area?
So other middle powers, including, for example, especially Japan and Australia, play a very important role in, helping Vietnam to improve its maritime capabilities. So I mentioned in the presentation that Japan has provided a lot of patrol boats to Vietnam, including 7 used one, 6 new one, and also give no loan to Vietnam to build more patrol boats. And for Australia, they really focus on capacity building, including English training for Vietnamese personnel, because in defense cooperation with other country, English is very important to communicate. So, Australia and including Singapore, they see that and provide a lot of English training for Vietnamese military personnel.
Yes, and the middle powers have also played important roles in the Mekong Basin. And you can see this by the institutional competition between these middle powers and China. And you have Australia, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand. They try to deepen engagement with lower Mekong countries to improve their water security capacity with the strategic goal of making them more independent vis-a-vis China. But these institutions, they have overlapping priorities. They are not really well coordinated. So the approach by the middle powers are still very fragmented. And you also have the issue of the US is not really committed to the lower Mekong region. And especially when you see that, the Trump administration recently has suspended a lot of US funded projects related to Mekong issues. So when it comes to effectiveness, China is still, when it comes to funding, when it comes to commitment, China is still having an advantage with the LMC, with substantial amount of funding for various socio-economic development projects, but also major infrastructure projects. So yes, the middle powers are playing increasing role, but they are still cannot outmatch China when it comes to funding.
All right.
Sorry,
Okay.
just want to add a point that because Dũng mentioned South Korea, and I realized that during my presentation, I didn't have chance to include, how South Korea has helped Vietnam. So the country actually have provided Vietnam at least 2 Pohang class corvette for its maritime domain awareness.
Okay. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, and I would like to take this chance for the speakers to give their last words, final points about their respective topics before we end the discussion. Let's start with Du.
Thanks, Florence. So I think even though my topic is more about marine plastic pollution in Vietnam, but I think this is the issues facing a lot of countries, not only my countries. And it is important for more regional and international cooperations. It's the point that I didn't have more time to highlight during my presentations. I think countries in the region need to share information more and help each other to improve its domestic law, as well at the international level. They have more binding mechanism for countries to strictly adopt the measure to deal with the issue of marine plastic pollutions. And hopefully by collaborative actions, we will be able to reduce marine plastic pollution as mentioned in Vietnam National Action Plan. So that's in my part. Thank you.
Dr. Baek.
Yeah, thanks, Florence. So I would like to say that, related to this panel, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was a debate between, Vietnamese scholars on whether Vietnam should focus more on continental security issue or maritime security issues. So this debate was, joined by I would like to acknowledge them. So it started with an article by Kang Vũ, and then Ewan Graham and I responded to that article. And then joined the debate was Nguyễn Thế Phương and then Ngô Zealand. So in general, I think the scholars, even though they have different emphasis, but I think the common theme is that Vietnam need to focus on both frontiers, but depends on the priority. They have to emphasize on more domain because they cannot, with limited resources, Vietnam cannot prioritize both domains. So I encourage everyone to check out that series to see, and it's up to you whether you see that Vietnam should focus on which area.
Pan, please.
Well, for me, I think when we talk about security challenges facing Vietnam, we often first think about the South China Sea. But I think it's equally important we should pay attention to the Mekong River because the crisis there is affecting the direct livelihoods of millions of Vietnamese. And is also becoming a space of geopolitical competition. And so it's essentially is also becoming a South China Sea flashpoint essentially. But the issue merits its own kind of scholarship and attention. So I hope that we will have more studies, more scholars looking into the issue and propose solutions to deal with both the environmental issues and also the geopolitical challenges.
And finally, Min.
I just have a short word as well. I think one of the broader themes that my topic tries to tackle is trying to shift away from our own very entrenched focus on great powers. I think it's quite pertinent to focus on local or regional politics as well, because even for smaller states in the region, as well for bigger states, the immediate neighbor is what most of our thinking and our relationship, our supply chains come from. And for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, these have often been the prominent theme throughout their history, especially for the smaller states there. The way they relate to their bigger neighbors, Vietnam, Cambodia, essentially sensitize their entire foreign policy making to the way that they think about foreign policy. But this is a lesson that can be approached to all Southeast Asian states in general as well. And the Philippines is somewhat of a more special case for sure, but think about the way that it has related or saw to or not see Southeast Asian countries or ASEAN as an effective way out of the issue, but instead chosen to tackle on the issue by itself alone is also an interesting topic, and that is worth thinking about as well. All of the regions all of the countries in the region have their own inflections by local politics that are often sort of drowned out in our own focus on great power politics. And I think more attention onto the way neighborly relations and regional politics would kind of make our own analysis more complete and understand why they act the way that they are. Thank you. That's all.
Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have left for today. On behalf of Fax Asia, we wish to thank all of our speakers and participants for this very fruitful discussion. I personally learned so much about Vietnam's security challenges, both at land and at sea. We hope to see you in our future events. If you have any questions or concerns, you can reach out through our channel, Fax Asia, on Facebook, at Fax Asia.org on Twitter, and also on our LinkedIn. You may also visit our website, www.faxasia.org, to stay updated on our projects.